regional monitoring. So the language appears up here, and it's what Heal the Bay suggested. So if they participate in regional monitoring, it should be more cost effective to them.
And how is someone going to find out if there is such an animal out there, a regional monitoring program? Do they find it out through us or through the region or both, or how?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Fran, the idea would be they'd reach out to the regional boards. I mean, theoretically, the regional board, state board would have an idea where these regional networks are happening. So I think that's our first preference, is to have people coordinate on a regional basis.
Do the regions know that they are going to be, this is going to be a request coming to them? Have we talked to them as
Don't
to
most
how
of them-
prepared they are for this?
Don't they want this? Aren't most of them pushing towards
Yeah,
it?
they do want
Yeah.
this. So I'm hoping they devote the the resources to respond to all requests. But this is an
If
interest
they
of
don't,
ours and
there's
also
a
the regional
serious
boards.
problem happening. That's
Right,
all I have to
so-
say.
Yeah, we can certainly reiterate that there's might be a demand for this, but
I'm anticipating there will be a demand for this, so I think that should be topic number one at the next roundtable, or whoever works on this.
Well, there may be some demand for this, but remember, this is third down the list, and the folks that are already doing ASBS or TMDL monitoring, that takes care of a large number of the cities that are greater than 50,000, which would have this option. So there potentially is some folks that will do this, but it's not like every MS4 will, a small MS4 permittee will have this requirement.
So the next concern was also from NRDC and Heal the Bay. And if you are a permittee that implements the TMDL Attachment G requirements, it could fall short. And you could be only monitoring for one pollutant in one stream segment. And it wouldn't take into consideration any regional watershed water quality issues. So to address this concern, we added new language to clarify that regional boards can require additional suite of urban pollutants, and the language is seen here. The next concern, again, was from NRDC and Heal the Bay, and their concern was that there's no linkage to special studies and program implementation effectiveness. So to address that concern, we revised the language, and it's seen here. The special studies must demonstrate the nexus between stormwater program implementation, water quality protection, and pollutant reduction effectiveness. If you remember at the January 8th workshop, there was a discussion about prioritized BMPs and what the definition was of that. We revised the language, but we should note that it is costly to evaluate every single BMP. So we revised the language and defined what prioritized BMPs are, and they're BMPs implemented based on pollutants of concern, where pollutants of concern are unidentified. Prioritized BMPs are based on common urban pollutants. The next area of concern was with illicit discharge detection and elimination program. The concern was that it requires costly industrial commercial inspections. So the concern was that we put language back into the permit to have these inspections, which is actually misinterpreted. The intent was not to require costly inspections. So we revised the permit to identify that only illicit discharges inspections would be from priority areas, and that they would implement investigation procedures of illicit discharges once during the permit term. And then we added a new self-certification program into the permit, and here's the language. Permittees require reports from authorized parties demonstrating the prevention and elimination of illicit discharges at their facilities in priority areas at least once over the length of the permit term.
Can you, I'm sorry, I know we talked about this. Can you remind me how priority areas are defined? Or who defines them?
Sure. So during the, there's an outfall mapping exercise as part of this. And so during that, they identify on their map priority areas, which we list in the permit. So this can be areas with older infrastructure, areas that have a history of illicit discharges, and it goes on and names these specific priority areas.
All right, that's what I just can't remember. So it's prioritized by likelihood of needing to
Exactly.
focus there, not prioritized based on an ASBS or something at the end of the discharge point. Okay, thanks.
Having some problems here. Okay, so the next concern was from the California Council of Environmental Economic Balance, SEEB. So their concern was that the permit is unnecessary and inappropriate requirements on linear underground overhead projects, and the permit failed to clarify exceptions for linear projects. So we revised the language in finding 39 to expand allowable discharges beyond utility vault discharges for hydrostatic testing and groundwater testing, and we added new language to clarify exceptions for linear projects, and the language is seen here. So unless the LUP has discrete location that has 5,000 square feet or more of new contiguous impervious surface, when the LUP has a discrete location that has 5,000 square feet or more of newly constructed contiguous impervious surface, only the specific discrete location is subject to section E12C. So the last revision was not discussed at the workshop, but is in the fourth and final draft. It's alternative post-construction requirements. We added new language to encourage and allow smart development and infill projects through alternative compliance. And it gives credit in the post-construction section. It creates incentives to identify and implement watershed scale projects that achieve multiple benefits. It was included to create region-wide watershed scale projects that are equal or more protective of water quality. And that is our presentation.
We have one additional proposed change, which didn't make it into the presentation because it came up this morning. One discharger on attachment B, the non-traditional list of dischargers, notified us, I don't think they can be at the meeting, but notified us that they had not heard about their designation until yesterday, and they were added recently, I think in the final order, so we're proposing that that discharger be taken off that list. And while you're hearing from other commenters, we'll just do a quick review of that attachment to see if any other dischargers may be in the same situation. This was a discharger designated by, I think, the Santa Ana board, and I think there was just a failure of communication between the regional board and the discharger that they were being designated. If you remember, the order does allow regional water boards to make these designations after adoption, so the regional board can come back and make that designation later, but we're proposing that we take them off.
I think the question is probably for Tom or Michael. I think early in the presentation, staff mentioned that there were no changes being proposed in response to the various comments on the receiving water limits issue. How is staff proposing to address that item and bring that item to the board since you're not proposing to address it in the permit itself?
Presently, this existing receiving water language is in place because of petition and the response the Water Board had for the petition, the order that they issued associated with it. And so because it's a precedential decision, it therefore has to be incorporated into all of the permits in the state. If we, as we move to address this issue, it seems like it is necessary again for the Water Board to either adopt this as a policy statement or as another precedential decision in order to ensure that it moves forward into all the subsequent stormwater permits. We have pending before us a couple of petitions that deal with this language. I think, well, we have one, actually, I'm sorry, well, 34 petitions, but one permit.
Is that Region 4?
4s.
Okay.
And so my thought, as we'd be talking with the board members about this, is that that would be the appropriate forum to move forward with any amendments that the board would like to consider to that precedential language.
And what is your thought with respect to the time frame for moving on that petition?
Defer to you on that one, Michael.
Well, certainly the LA petitions provide a vehicle for addressing this, although I should say that it's not a foregone conclusion that that will be the vehicle. And our expectation is that within the next year, part of the problem and why I think that the original staff recommendation included breaking this issue out separately is that it cuts across a number of issues or a number of different permitting programs, small MS4, large MS4, Caltrans, and frankly, a lot of your staff and the bandwidth that has been associated with reissuing those permits has not provided, in my mind, neither an appropriate forum nor a space in which to really consider this issue thoughtfully. And so our thought is going forward as these permits are ticked off, it frees up some of the staff time so that we can really focus on what is a very difficult problem. We've obviously received a lot of very helpful comment along each step of the way and during the workshop in November. But our goal would be to address it either through that petition process or if, as we go down that path, we recognize there's a better vehicle, we break it off and do it that way, but it would be sometime within the next year.
Does that mean sometime in 2013 or 2014?
I would expect sometime within 2013 or potentially the first 2 months of 2014. That is what we'd be targeting.
I guess since we're speculating right now, it would be helpful, very helpful, to the stakeholders in particular, that you come back, that Tom, you come back in the next couple of months and be more specific as to when the stakeholders can expect this to be addressed, because they will be very interested. This room will be. We need to get a bigger room, so that we can, this is good enough for right now because you don't really know, but we should start to hone in on that pretty quick. So I would ask that you come back within a month if possible, but certainly no later than 2 months to give stakeholders a strong sense of what they've got in front of them.
Okay, we'll do that.
I agree, and I would also encourage, to the extent that you can, to try to expedite the petition. I recognize that we've got staff continuing to work on, we still have one more stormwater permit to go through. That's if we adopt this one today, otherwise we'll still have two. But I think there would be support and interest from my colleagues on the board to make this petition a priority, but of course, I'm sure Michael will want to discuss with us what that means in terms of other petitions that are in the pipeline.
Sure. And I should say, I mean, part of the issue, and we've heard offers from CASQA and some of the stakeholders involved here about wanting to set meetings and start a dialogue on this issue. And that's why I say that the petition vehicle may still not be the right place to consider some of these issues, because we'd like to have a more open dialogue about the issue. And as you know, the petition process tends to be more narrowly focused on the individual petitioners and various ex parte rules associated with it. But we will certainly keep moving. I'll work with staff to get a timeline to Mr. Howard as to how we will address this issue, so that at least we can communicate that out to the state.
So based on what you just said, though, let me amend Fran's proposal somewhat, and that is when you come back to us in a month or whenever, not just update us on the petition, but I encourage you to meet with the various stakeholders between now and then, and also present us some other options to address the receiving water limits issue.
The stakeholders won't know what to do if we don't have a process where they can meet all the time. They'll miss each other. It's important.
You can tell her you can't hear her, Janine?
So I believe that
It's gonna
concludes
be
the
hell to
staff's
pay, I know that.
presentation.
That it? Let's do this. We have quite a few speaker cards. Let's take a break for 10 minutes in the interest of humanity, and you'll all be fresh and invigorated and ready to tell us how much you all support this proposal. What are you laughing about, Jeff? We'll resume here in 10 minutes.
Mike Carabini, friends of the board. Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, I'm Eric, and so Allie was going to give you a call back. But you, yeah, did she ever get back to you? I've heard. So yeah, it's the plaster permit covers Colfax. So Colfax was in the plaster permit last time, and they're going to be in the coming permit as well. They're a renewal permittee. So Placer County unincorporated actually includes Colfax, so they're covered just because of that. It's incorporated. Colfax doesn't, I believe, but you're saying it's included in the Placer County. Right, they deal with them. Yeah, we basically have, there's Roseville, there's South Lake Tahoe, there's Northern El Tahoe City, and then the rest of Placer is basically covered under this rule. Placer's actually fully covered under this rule permits. Okay, so the provisions here on ongoing or, yeah, they're renewal permit. Yeah, Colfax had just applied for the last one in 2003. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I'll look forward to this call. Yeah. Okay, well, we're here. I mean,
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. Hello out there. No, we're not turned on. Is that good now? Hello? You know, I've said this before, and I really hate to interrupt you because probably the conversation that's gone on out here in the last 10 minutes is going to be one of the most productive things that happens all day. And I truly hate to have you all have to sit down, but we need to get on with our meeting. So, Christine, are you and Emil done for the time being? Terry Fashing, would you like to come forward, please? Okay. I don't know.
Hello. Good morning, Chair Hoppen and members of the board. I appreciate this opportunity to comment on the final
Terry,
draft of the Phase 2 permit.
It's just been pointed out to me that my cards aren't really
I thought that was
complete.
odd that I would.
Yes,
first.
it is.
You
So
want me to come back
if
later?
if you don't mind coming back a little later,
I would
and
be
I can do
delighted.
this in the correct form of the agenda
Absolutely. Thank you.
that I have here on my.
We'll be waiting with bated breath to
Yes.
find out what you would have said.
I wanted to have a little teaser there, Terry, so they'd all wonder what you were going to say when you came up. So it worked out. That's the way I had it planned, kind of. Will the California Stormwater Quality Association staff please come up?
Only if they can do better.
Unless nobody wants to join Jeff, and then we'll let him come up by himself.
Terry's going to be a hard act to follow. Well, good morning, Chairman Hoppen and board members. My name is Jeff Barroso. I'm the Executive Director for the California Stormwater Quality Association, or CASQA. And I should say congratulations to Chair Hoppen for your pending retirement. I can say that you have created a very humane atmosphere here in the meeting room every time I've been before you, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
So thanks again for the opportunity to comment on the permit today. We really appreciate the changes that have been made to the last revision of the permit, and want to thank staff again for meeting with us on a regular basis to clarify some of the provisions and listen to our concerns and comments. As connoted by this, by the presentation of the 5-year timeline to get to today, we suspect that everybody would really like to have this permit adopted today. Not that you have to necessarily, but we sort of feel that vibe, I guess, in the room from at least some of us. So we, in that spirit, we're really at the point, I think, at CASQA of hopefully helping to do that today, basically. It's our sense that this is a permit that we can live with. If a couple of minor edits are made, and we have taken the liberty of making some edits to a little sheet of paper that I've given to Janine, and if you decide you want to think about those, you do have those. Okay, thank you. I can walk you through those. The first one has to do with provision E7A on public education and outreach, and in particular it's provision E7A little Roman numeral 2J, which has to do with educating school-age children. And the first sentence actually in that provision says something to the effect of permittees shall provide schools with educational materials. Pretty basic requirement. And so we're focused more on the second sentence, the follow-up sentence to that sentence, which in the latest draft of the permit, a verb was changed from shall to may. So that second follow-up sentence says, the permittee shall use environmental and place-based experiential learning, which is integrated into school curricula and school facility management. And our concern, I guess, is with that verb change from a may to a shall. The concern that we're hearing from some of the permittees is that many of them already have outreach strategies in place, and they wish to have some flexibility in terms of what they actually use in terms of materials being provided to the schools that they are working with. And so they don't have necessarily a problem with place-based learning or experiential learning. It's just that they have a certain strategy in mind. They like to be able to have the ability to potentially use other materials. So to address that interest, we're recommending in our edit that shall be replaced with the words encouraged to. And then this language actually would be consistent with the language that's in the non-traditional section of the permit, which does use the wording is encouraged to. And then we've gone ahead and made a couple of what we think are grammatical changes to that sentence, because the sentence is a little bit hard to understand what exactly it's saying anyway in its current form. We think it's about the materials that are referenced in the first sentence, but it doesn't say materials. So we added the word materials in there. So that's a change that we're asking you to consider making.
So it's not, there's no problem with doing the education, it's just how you do it.
I think it's a matter of what are we, the first sentence says provide schools with these materials. Second sentence describes the kinds of materials that they would be provided with, we think. And what we're saying is give us some flexibility in terms of what materials we would provide them. I think that's what we're trying to get at there. So,
Let me ask staff, what was your thinking when you changed the may to shall?
So the rationale behind changing may to shall is that, you know, we've looked at examples of outdoor education, for example, SPLASH programs, for example, SPLASH and FER, and the return for them is great as far as children and their education and their knowledge and their behavior change actually going outdoors. And so if we say may, then it really doesn't, you know, require them to do it. They may consider it. So we change it to shall, but we do say that if there is not one in the area, a local program, that they can, you know, look at other programs that are possibly equivalent or something in place of that.
And what is the difference, Christine, between E7A and F5B, where you use the term is encouraged to use instead of shall?
So we're looking at. So the difference between section E and section F?
I'm looking at the handout that CASQA provided, and if I'm reading it correctly, and Jeff will pipe up if I'm not, he pointed out that for F5B21J, I guess on page 89, the language is encouraged in that section.
Well, the difference between the two sections for section E is for traditional small MS4s, and then section F is for non-traditional MS4s. So that's the big distinction. But, you know, in looking at my permit writing team, I think that we would be okay with changing it to encourage.
Thank you.
thank you.
I will make a comment. I mean, normally something like this would seem like boring boilerplate to me, but when I look at these permits and I look at the challenges that we have on all our stormwater issues, this inverse parental pressure coming from children to do the right thing is the reason we don't have a bazillion cans laying along the side of the road anymore. And so I think this is probably a more important component than someone might otherwise think, because it's hard to change old habits, but when children realize this is the way it needs to be done, they put pressure on their parents to get something done. So I'm not calling this boilerplate.
But I would, if you put materials at the end of experiential learning, I agree with you. We should put we could put materials after to use materials, and because experiential learning may not have stuff attached to it. It may be going out and feeling things or smelling things or, you know, doing a lot of other stuff. So I think the sentence was correct in that they were trying to bring in some other ideas. I totally agree about encourage to. But I think if you want to include materials and, you know, all this, the experiential learning, I think to me that would take care of what you're concerned about.
Yeah.
it's not just material. It's not just stuff, you know, pieces of paper.
Right, right. And as I say, I think we support that kind of learning and that kind of education, and it's just a matter of giving some flexibility in terms of just what we provide to the schools is all really. So the other and second comment we had was regarding section E12F, which is on hydromodification management. And this section was included, it's sections in red, underlined, strike through red today. It was included in the May 2012 version of the draft permit. And at the time, others and we commented on it, and it was actually removed from the permit back in the earlier version. And so it's our sense today at this hour that we don't believe that there's justification for reinserting that language after it was taken out last summer as interim hydromodification criteria. And that's because the permit has in it already, for the first time, retention-based LID measures, which we in the industry are seeing those really, and they're kind of starting to be called sort of baseline hydromodification measures for the most part. Some of the phase 1 programs in Southern California see the retention-based LID measures as basically the beginnings of hydromodification management, essentially. And so they see it as kind of a baseline effort on that. It's showing up in the phase 2 permit now for the first time. So our sense is that you're not losing anything by not having this new language put back in there. You've already got a baseline program being established through the phase 2s over the next several years. And as we had commented previously on the technical side of things, we're concerned that the approach in that interim criteria, it's an approach that involves peak matching standards and things. And we've commented before that there's some unknown consequences, unintended consequences, that even maybe detrimental consequences to that approach. So we're just not sure it's ready for prime time, I guess is what I'm saying, really. And so we're recommending that you take that language back out again for a second time, essentially. If you do not remove that language, at a minimum, we think the board should acknowledge that there are other criteria available that probably are closer to being ready for prime time. And that we suggest the language that I'm showing you here on the table, which is provide the ability to do an alternative if you don't remove that language now. And that language would say, alternatively, a project may use an equally protective geomorphic-based hydromodification standard. So ideally, we'd like to see the language come out, but if you feel like there's good reasons to leave it in, then adding in that alternative approach language would be helpful.
Any comment from staff regarding the additional language being proposed?
I can give you, do you want a rationale for why it's back in yet another time, or is that, or just, I think, so the rationale, we basically, and Tam, I think you talked us into realizing how
Oh, sure,
difficult
blame it
would
on me.
be. Yeah, so you're the reason why it's coming back. No, but we're basically, you know, I don't think we can come up with watershed-based criteria in 2 years. And I think one of the things that we wanted to do is just have some baseline channel protection criteria, and that's why that's back in there. So it's peak flow. You know, Jeff brings up a good point that it might not be protective. I think one of the problems in the past is that we've defaulted just to peak flow management for channel protection without doing all the runoff reduction type things beforehand. And I think this permit is so focused on runoff reduction that our feeling is once you get to these larger projects, you're going to essentially come close to matching a hydrograph. It is a peak flow standard. It is sort of old school, but we think that in the spirit of making baby steps towards hydromod, this is an appropriate measure. I don't think we have too much heartburn over having alternative measures. I think the problem is, and I think this is one of the things we're working on statewide as far as, and I'll mention sort of the framework that we have for basically leading into these annual check-ins on hydromod and post-construction. We have an ongoing group right now that sort of came out of the white paper that Greg and basically instrumented with SWRCB and Colorado State and others, and I think we're following up with a series of workshops where we're going to create the dialogue on this. The thing that's out there right now, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what that protective standard is. I think I've talked to you before about this. It really depends on, there's really a time and place component, and there's a real geomorphic, you know, spatial component to all this, and I feel like the proof would be to demonstrate something that's equivalent. I think we're okay with having something. If a permittee could demonstrate that this is as protective, I think we'd be okay with that. We just have to be careful about what that is. So I think in concept, I think we're open to it.
My sense was you're trying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but create some kind of a floor for these larger projects, almost as, as we move into this phase, but as we work on more specifics for implementation after 2
So-
years.
Let me put it in a slightly different way, the logic. We originally foresaw that we were going to have these watershed management zones within a couple of years, and that would be our approach to hydro modification. And as such, we didn't need any specific requirements in the permit. When we realized that that was going to take longer and it was likely to be not in this permit term or very near the end of this permit term, was felt that we needed to go back to having some sort of a backstop for hydro modification. So we reinserted the language. I believe that staff has no problem with the idea of providing an alternative to that if it's as protective. The idea is that we don't want to spend this whole permit term without anything.
Those were my comments. Thank you very much. If you have any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. And I guess just a comment. Thank you. I appreciate the recommended language change. It's helpful to have those. A request for you and other speakers for today or future items is, I think it will be very helpful if you were to bring it in a format that Janine could then put on screen for the folks in the audience as well as those that are watching the webcast.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. The NRDC panel for presentation.
And is there a... Thanks. Good morning, Chair Hoppin, members of the board. My name is Noah Garrison. I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'd also like to share in Mr. Brousseau's congratulations on your retirement, Chair Harpin. In my limited time appearing before this board, it's been an absolute pleasure to work and meet with you. And as one of your remaining potential projects, I would suggest that potentially you could look at finding a way for everyone in this room to dress down at these hearings and bring our dogs along.
No, I have to tell you a story, and I don't know the fellow's name, but during the previous administration, he was with Cali, PA, and he was very European and extremely dapper dresser. He always had a very nice pocket linen and was just dressed impeccably. And we were in the elevator one day, and I didn't know his name, but we always say hello. And he looked at me and he said, my life has changed since you've been at the water board. And I thought, what did I do to inspire this? I was just very flattered. And I said, how is that? He said, look at me, no tie.
Well, that's certainly an example that I appreciate. So,
thank you.
At any rate, I wanted to begin by extending my gratitude to staff who have really, I think, gone above and beyond in engaging with stakeholders and have been extremely responsive and open to discussion on virtually all the permit terms that have come up in our presentations, at least. And I'd really like to thank them for their efforts. It's been, again, also a pleasure to work with them. I have only a couple of comments today that I'm going to make. A lot of these, based on discussion I've had with staff in the last few days, will end up being in support of revisions to the permit, but I will go through those quickly. I do want to start again that, with the baseline premise that stormwater controls are necessary and practicable, and the whole reason we are here is because of the pervasive pollution problems that face California waters, and to make sure that we clean these waters up, not only for recreation purposes and so that California residents and visitors can make use of these waters, but also they are absolutely critical to California's economy. And so doing this is economically a step in the right direction. This isn't something where the cost is outweighed by the benefits. The benefits, in most cases, vastly outweigh the costs, and we're really glad to see strong permit provisions being put in place. Again, I also want to put this in context that the basis of many, if not most of the permit terms that we discussed today is the Clean Water Act's maximum extent practicable standard, and that this is an evolving standard, and that in Phase 1 and Phase 2 permits, with each iteration, we will see stronger permit terms and new permit terms, and to a point, MEP applies broadly to both Phase 1 and Phase 2. There's really no distinction after a point, so that whether or not these standards are maybe meeting Phase 1 permits, is appropriate. It's not that there's such a leap from the prior permit, it's that at a certain point, all of our permits should be meeting these standards. So, again, California has a huge percentage of its waters that are impaired for one or more uses, and many of them in Phase 2 communities, and we'd like to see those waters cleaned up, and more importantly, or equally as important, to see that new development in communities that grow rapidly do not end up impairing the waters in their jurisdictions. So with that, I'm going to focus almost entirely on the post-construction development section, and we really do agree with staff's approach of moving much more towards a sort of a low-impact development or green infrastructure-based approach that takes into account site design principles. In part, because EPA has pointed out that these tend to be cost-effective with comparison to the previous paradigm of using engineered solutions. These are cost-effective and extremely good from a water quality standpoint, and for many other benefits that they bring, such as water supply, open space habitat. These are great tools that we have to work with, and we're glad to see the permit work or move in that direction. I'll talk about some of the specific terms that staff has pointed out that the permit previously may have been slightly unclear as to whether retention was required before biofiltration might be used. We're glad to see that they've inserted language into the permit in section E12, E2C, and in 2D to show that biotreatment, or as the permit refers to it, bioretention, is only allowed once it's determined to be technically infeasible to retain the runoff on site. Technical infeasibility can refer to a broad spectrum of conditions, including site constraints, soils, high groundwater levels, potential impacts to a receiving water, but we are glad to see that they've inserted language in that says that the filtration with discharge is allowed only when it's infeasible to retain the runoff. We're also glad to see that where there were alternatives that were listed, there's a series of 4 alternatives listed under E2G, that they have clarified that an alternative practice must meet all 4 of the conditions. It's not sort of a pick and choose menu, so that certainly is something that we approve of and appreciate staff's efforts. And finally, we're glad to see that they have greater clarified what they mean by smart growth. There was a sort of a vague provision that was in the last iteration that allowed for a lesser standard to be applied to smart growth projects, but it didn't really define what smart growth meant. It didn't really define what was required of it, and it set no real baseline as to what a minimum standard was. So we're glad to see that they've changed that and now require that smart growth would still have to apply treatment, but it would be an exception to having to meet the retention or biofiltration standard specifically. Let's see if I can get this to move. I may have frozen. There we go. Okay. The area that we do have some concern with, and this is one of the areas I do want to talk about briefly, are with sections E2K and L, which deal with sort of alternative processes in 2 different forums. The first one being watershed management plans that can be, or watershed-based plans that are put together by the permittees. We absolutely support watershed-based planning, and we think that trying to find controls that are appropriate for the watershed and that are going to holistically, for lack of a better term, address many of the concerns that may be in a specific watershed as opposed to just on a site level is absolutely a strong approach. With that, though, we want to make sure that there are baseline requirements in place, and we think that not just for water quality, we thought that the appropriate approach was to say that they should be meeting retention of the 85th percentile storm unless there is a strong reason not to, not just that it's equally protective of water quality. So we'd like to see that in. I think we're okay with the language as it stands now for requiring at least equivalent water quality protection, but we think that really the basis for that really ought to be retention of the 85th percentile storm. The lingering concern that we do really have, though, is that with these watershed plans and also with the section adjacent to it that allows for regional plans, that there's no baseline requirement for on-site treatment of runoff. In either case, theoretically, new development can be built and be considered to be part of a larger watershed plan that might allow for off-site compliance, in lieu compliance, any number of other sort of non-site specific controls that could be put in place that would allow that new project to discharge runoff to a receiving water with absolutely no protection in place. And we don't believe that either the Clean Water Act or this board's order in Bellflower, State Water Board Order 2011, allow for that. What we'd like to see is sort of a catch-all provision put in place in the permit that just states that regardless of any exemption, exception, or participation in a off-site regional or watershed plan, any new development or redevelopment project that is categorized under the priority development projects must treat conventionally any discharge before it reaches a receiving water for the 85th percentile storm. We think this is an appropriate control. It's in many of the other permits that are currently in California, including Los Angeles, Ventura, South Orange County, North Orange County. All of these permits have a catch-all that say that if you're going to do off-site treatment where your runoff is ultimately going to discharge to a receiving water and you may get credit for runoff retained somewhere else, that you have to treat your runoff before it's discharged. The Clean Water Act really requires this under the provisions of 1342P, under the Code of Federal Regulations at 40 CFR 122.34, new development and redevelopment projects have to have controls to reduce the discharge pollutants in runoff. And the example I'll give for why this is so critical is that, let's say you have a development that you're going to put up at Site A. It's a brand new development, covers 1 acre, several acres, whatever the sizing is, and you're going to then receive credit for off-site mitigation somewhere else in the watershed, but for completely different volume of water that is not hydrologically related to the new project. You've now created a brand new project that may be in the built environment for 60, 80, or 100 years that will have absolutely no controls on the runoff in it. We're going to effectively introduce new development that will cause problems of pollution to persist over time. So if you take new development A and you say we don't have any controls here, and you receive credit for doing something at Site B a couple of miles away within the watershed, that site may be an older site that would have been redeveloped anyway within the next 10, 15, 20 years. So you're going to have development that is going to last in the built environment longer with no controls on it. So for any new development or redevelopment project that's done, regardless of whether the treatment is going to be on-site, it's going to be at a regional project, it's going to be an in lieu fee or something else, we would ask that you put in place a control that says you have to treat conventionally the 85th percentile storm. That kind of treatment is always practicable. There are no site constraints that ever go towards using sort of conventional sand filters, oil water separators, other controls, and BMPs that are engineered solutions on a site, and they should be required for all development regardless of where ultimate compliance with the retention requirements is met. I'm happy to answer questions if my description of the differing projects or properties was confusing at all.
I have a question, if you don't mind, and you may be getting to it on that. And I'm just still trying to envision the challenge. When I look at this and I look at the permit term, I'm looking at how do we, there are progressive local governments who are trying to meet multiple needs that involve water supply and water quality and flood control. And we want to be encouraging that. We want to be encouraging the political infrastructure that encourages that. So the example of a brand new bigger than an acre development that might have an alternative compliance where they're doing something really big that helps in a large regional thing, I have to think about a little bit, because at that size, figuring out how to do on-site stuff is not as hard. Right. When you say redevelopment, what I'm seeing in my mind is infill development, where you're actually, in many cases, you are reducing the exposed surface because you're densifying, and you don't have a lot of room to do a lot of things. So in some ways, just trying to make sure that we're not making, just assuring a big expense somewhere when they might be able to participate. I'm trying to tie it to what their actual impact is on the ultimate receiving water quality, and if there's a better way to use resources collectively, you want to encourage that.
Absolutely.
So I see the fear. I'm just trying to figure out if the solution to the fear defeats the objective of getting people incentivized into thinking about these regional or even just small collective projects that might be, it might have better placement, either because of where the groundwater is or just where a park is or where you can get it together with multiple jurisdictions.
Absolutely, and I think the permit to begin with something like smart growth or infill already provides appropriate off-ramps for those types of projects. It allows for biotreatment, and even where that's infeasible, the permit allows for using tree box filters or other mechanisms to treat. And again, I think it should be clear that they still have to meet the same volume requirement. The concern we have is much more with projects that may elect, for whatever reason, and this is sort of an elective choice, to perform off-site mitigation or some other process rather than creating the controls on site or at a regional project at which the water is at least conveyed to a regional project